An old master said, "In the beginning, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers." When we thoroughly study, we see that mountains are no longer mountains and rivers are not rivers. But then at the end, we realize mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers again.
I'm here again with Greg Keys.
So you do your 2 books, and the way it typically works is you do your contribution to the series and you're kaput, you're out.
Yeah.
But then, there's 2 authors brought back. One is Jim Lucino, and then the other is you. And you said there was an interesting circumstance where they brought you back for Final Prophecy. Can you talk about that? Like what that was like?
I mean, I think they called me back to help figure out how it was going to end. At a certain point, it had gotten a little out of hand, and they wanted to sort of figure out a way to tie it all back together. And they brought me in for that.
Now, was there someone else slated to do it and they dropped out? Or
well, there had been a book. There had been another book. And I think what I have talked about before is how there wasn't just the editors at Del Rey, and it wasn't just like Sue Rostoni and the people there. They had a group of readers, huge Star Wars fans, and they would let them read drafts of these books. And if collectively they didn't give a book a passing grade, it didn't get published. I do know that precipitated them bringing me back was a failure of this book. The fact that they weren't going to publish it. Lucasfilms, they're like, we don't want any really bad Star Wars books, right? So that's, in a way, that's admirable, because in especially back then, in the world of licensed fiction, there are definitely people that just didn't care. Like there are licensed books that got published that were just awful in every way. There's no accountability. The authors didn't put a lot of effort into it. And to be fair, they often happen to be written really quickly. I mean, my Star Wars books were written in about 3 months, maybe 4 months tops. That's compared to, at the time, I was spending at least a year writing my own stuff. So that's a skill in and of itself. Like, there's some people out there that are excellent writers, but they can't write a book in 3 weeks. Even if I were going to tell you who the authors were, and I wouldn't if I could remember their names, but I don't even remember now who it was. But there was a book right before one of mine that got canceled, and I had to sort of pick up right before Final Prophecy. So I had to pick up some of the slack that book was supposed to cover. So they're like, in fact, I was not originally intended to write another Star Wars book in the New Jedi Order. And I think that the failure of that earlier manuscript precipitated it, like that, and the fact that they wanted me in on the big discussions about what's actually going on here, like Zenoma Sakat and all that stuff. Like, we need to put this all together because we're bringing this to an end,
to a close. Yeah.
And so we need to tie up the loose ends. We need to get the authors that they picked some of us to be involved, and to try to figure out how to close it all out. And obviously a lot of the threads continued into other series, but the New Jedi Order had a beginning, a middle, and an end. People at Del Rey were really comfortable with me at that point, and Sue was too. They thought I could help them sort of organize how this was all going to come to a close. And it wasn't just me, obviously. It was a bunch of people involved, but yeah, I was not expecting to do a third book at all. It was not something that had been planned. It was not, and it was kind of interesting because I had to I hadn't necessarily been keeping up with the New Jedi Order after my books because I was busy with another series of my own. So I, of course, did go back and read the intervening stuff, most of it anyway, or the stuff that I really had to read.
I wanted to ask, so you actually introduced a lot of characters in your Edge of Victory stuff that, you know, I don't want to say they took over the series, but they had a huge role. I mean, you had, I mean, Tahiri for one,
Right.
but you and Nenyim, who you created, but you got to introduce Onami and the whole thing with the eighth cortex.
Honestly.
Was it tricky to pick it up now, having the other authors in the intervening time maybe made changes, or was?
Yeah, of course, because and especially when there are changes like, oh, wait, what have they done to this character? What, you know, what have they? But you know, again, you have to honor it because it's there. So, and
Right.
it's not mine, even though I create Nenyim, for instance, and even though I pulled like Tahiri, so I didn't create her, but I pulled her out of obscurity and made her a person in the stories. They're still not mine. You know, I mean, they're still not mine. So, not the way that the characters in a book that I've written beginning to finish on my own are. So, you know, I'm in that sense, I feel like I'm a team player. I'm pretty good at working within the boundaries of what's happened, and I have seen other people who are more like, no, I'm going to grind this character back to where they were when I was working with them, but I've never quite seen the point of doing that, right? And especially when I'm working with characters that have really undergone, you know, significant change, which is what fiction is largely about, right? Then I just try to understand where they are now and work with them at that point. So tricky, I guess it's a little tricky because you're always afraid you're going to get it wrong, and miss the point of what's been happening. But it also makes it interesting.
Is that kind of a temptation when you get into writing something if you've already experienced time with those characters before, be it in a previous book? Like in this case, you had a couple years gap between Edge of Victory and Final Prophecy. Once you've seen the characters before, to think, you know what, there's something about this character that I want to fix, or there's something about this character that I think just hasn't gone right, and I want to insert just enough of a tweak that the character can go off in kind of a direction that makes more sense. Is that something that I know that sometimes they might not allow it to happen.
Right.
Is it a big temptation?
It is a temptation, and I'm sure that, and I know for a fact that some of the other authors have taken this temptation a step further than they were really allowed to. I mean, so there are limits, obviously, on anything you do like that. What you have to realize in the Star Wars universe is, and you guys know this, is that if another author takes your character and does something with them, it still happened. You can't pretend it didn't just because you made up the character.
But you can try to clean it up, like the whole
Yes.
Mara and Lando dating thing in those Kevin J. Anderson's books, and then later on Timothy Zahn picking it up going, oh, we weren't really dating, that was just a cover for our spy job, you know?
Yeah, you can do things like that. You can bend, but you can't break anything. So, yeah, I mean, I thought I certainly wanted to tweak Tahiri back to a certain place. I enjoyed some of the horrible things that happened to her.
I think it deepened her character.
Yeah.
Made her a nut
No,
job.
I mean, and obviously she was going to react badly to Anakin's death.
So,
I think Tahiri is a great example of this character that has been on this journey. I mean, Anakin has died, and then she, of course, actually they have their first kiss in your
right.
duel. I actually really like that little romance myself.
Yeah.
But-
And then he dies, and she goes off the rails a little bit.
I thought that it was a little protracted, and I also thought that she had kind of reached this really ambiguous place where I think nobody quite knew what to do with her.
I actually like the way Tahiri turned. I like that she kind of went freak out, wild, crazy, weird, too.
Yeah.
And that she wasn't just like, okay, I'm back, I'm better now, you know?
Yeah, it was what's interesting about that, is, and I know that people like Mike Stackpole and Tim Zahn, this has happened to them a lot, but that was the first, that character, and then, because I, in some ways, felt like I kind of recreated her.
You did. You did. You grew her up.
And then, of course, other authors get a hold of her and do things that I'm like, some I liked, some I didn't. And I felt very much the same about Nenyim, the Shaper, because she was actually
Your character.
completely my character, So So I try to be really respectful when I'm handling other people's characters.
Then the other personality, this kind of the Rena self, and then they join before your book.
Mhm.
But to pick her up again, it's so interesting that she describes it as though she's the child of these parent personalities. That's just a fascinating subject. Like this person of two worlds. It's almost like in Star Trek they have Spock or
Right. Worf.
or Worf. These characters that have such different lineages. I did not see the Nen Yim connection coming. That when she goes, wait, those are mine. Whoa.
Yeah.
My memories. I really, that was a twist. And you actually got me pretty sad when Nen Yim died. I was like, she was like my favorite at this point.
Well, you should be sad like when she died, but yeah, I liked her. I mean, she's a good character.
She's like a scientist. It's so fascinating, like to have someone like that in this world.
Yeah, and a bit of a heretic, really. I mean,
It's just like forbidden science. I liked that distrust between Harar and Nen Yim because they're from totally different social strata.
Right.
And they're like, what's each other's angle here? And it takes them a long time. The internal politics of the Yushin Vong, like, you've got Shimra's political opponents like Correal. You've got the caste system. So you've got the Shapers with Nen Yim and Harar with the priests. And then there's Onami, which is a total kind of wild card. He's that jester, but there's something odd about him.
Right.
And it's so complicated. There's always a situation of discretion and secrets, and everybody has an angle. I mean, what was your thought process writing that?
There I was working with a lot of elements that did not originate with me, right? There obviously are elements that did, like Nen Yim, and the Shapers in general. But a lot of it also had kind of been transformed a little bit, like it had been through several other authors since me, and had to be aware of what they had done, with what I began, and then I had to preserve what other authors had done too. But I mean, I kind of like these complex political situations. I think they're interesting and make for interesting reading. Like I said, the Yushin Vong started off very simple, but they got much more interesting as we started to understand that not only there are different castes, but there's different factions, there are different ideas about what they're actually up to and how things ought to turn out. And there's also like this past that they sort of forgotten, right? To a certain extent, like they've gotten off track a little bit. But in terms of like just dealing with all these different factions and different things, that just interests me, and I enjoy doing that kind of writing.
It's so fascinating. I think what you said about the Yushin Vong, and this is a credit to all the different writers and their different styles. That's one neat thing about the series. Everybody brings something different to the table. Is that that I definitely believe that the New Jedi Order series is kind of a grower of a series. Like you read it, and sure, it starts off with a bang, but once you really get into it, you're just like, man, this is so interesting and so not just unique, but complicated, because it is a political situation. Everyone wants something else.
Right.
And of course, by the point of the final prophecy, the reader is wondering, how is this all going to come together? And that was such an interesting thing. At the end, Numenor is the real villain. Of course, we know Shimra is the villain, but there's a period of time throughout that book where you're like, this is so interesting because nobody here is really evil. I mean, Numenor.
Yeah, they all have their agendas, and they all think they're doing something. And that's just how I think as a person, as an author. It's not that I don't think that there are people that I would. I definitely think there are people that probably aren't redeemable, but I still think those people think that they're onto something.
Yeah,
right. I mean, like they're what they're onto might be awful, but they're coming from someplace. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, "I'm just going to be evil today." That's just not how it's not how people work.
And with Numenor, this guy, I mean, he's a fan favorite, and I can see why, because my reaction to him is always just get a load of this guy. I mean, he really doesn't have any scruples at all.
No.
But maybe I'm almost reminded, maybe this is not in your mind at all, but the whole thing of play acting as the prophet, Yusha, which is actually a tremendously close word to Yeshua, which is Jesus.
Yeah, I don't think I came up with that. I remember noticing that too. And I was like, is this okay? But it was already there. So
yeah, I wasn't the only one. Okay. But yeah, so when I read his, and he's play acting this prophet role, he's just taking bits, he's coming up with that as he goes. I saw Dune films, the new Dune films, and Paul Atreides, he takes on this role for the Fremen that he doesn't even believe in.
Yeah, this sort of Messiah.
Yeah,
role.
but then it turns out kind of to be true. And I mean, I don't know if that was an influence per se, but like, can you talk about writing Numenor? And I mean, whether that was in your mind or not, just that whole notion of someone, they are living out a lie, and then there's this moment where you go, wait a second, is this actually real?
I think a lot of what I was thinking with him was just, the entire idea of these sort of religious charlatans, like these opportunists that mine belief and prophecy for their own purposes. Actually, there was a Steve Martin movie, now to think about it, where he's like a traveling, evangelist, but he's complete humbug. Like he doesn't believe any of it, right? But he's like a faith healer and all this stuff. And then actually things start happening. And he's like, oh, and it changes him. Like it changes him because he starts thinking, I'm a fake, but somehow this stuff is happening now. And it's kind of a complicated movie, actually. It's kind of interesting. I can't remember what it's called. And I'm not sure I was thinking about that, but I think I've always thought a lot about, you have to remember, like, my young adulthood was full of these things like Tammy Faye Baker and, all this stuff, like with the religious right, these people that were these television evangelists, and then they would turn out to be not just have feet of clay, just to be like these horrible hypocrites with, all kinds of crap going on. And, I grew up in, again, Mississippi, which is, a fairly fundamentalist area, but I was actually not raised that way, but I was surrounded by it. Right. So I'm always kind of been tuned in to that kind of thing. And, what Numenor was doing seemed pretty natural to me. Like, it's not something I wasn't familiar with. And it's also something that's happened historically. It's happened quite a lot, right? I mean, if you can harness that, the power of what people believe and the prophecy, then you can probably, go far, as long as you don't mess it up.
It's amazing too, because he's this guy who he's so egotistical that anytime it comes into his mind, well, wait a second, maybe I'm part of a larger thing here, he pretty much instantly dismisses it. No, that would be ridiculous because I made this up.
Right. But he's cognizant of what he's doing, at least, yeah. But it kind of points to the fact that he doesn't really believe much of anything, right? So even when stuff starts happening, that clearly begs the question of what's actually going on here, he's going to reject it, right? So,
well, and that's an interesting thing throughout your novels that maybe it's good to pick up on, is that, Mezon-Quad and even Onami when he pretends to be a shaper, and then you have, Numenor, this thing of these people in high positions who they end up either being duplicitous or actually not believing in what they're peddling. And maybe it comes from what you're talking about. Yeah.
Probably. Yeah. It's probably a fundamental distrust I have of that kind of power structure. because they're not dumb people, right? They're pretty smart. And if you're pretty smart, then at some point you start questioning, not only is this all real or is this true, but if it isn't, maybe it's still better that I work within the framework, right?
The shamed ones who are caught up in that, that's the funny thing is even if he doesn't believe it, he creates something real by them he doesn't originate it, but he leads this thing. Were the shamed ones inspired at all from like the Untouchables and like India?
It's hard to believe that there's nothing of that in them.
Right.
Because when you want to look at a caste system that's got something like that, you definitely, think of India. There are other caste systems in the world, but India's got the most complicated, definitely got one of the most complicated caste systems you can imagine.
I like your little details that you had in there, like when I think Corran goes over to Tassel to hear his head, and she jerks away, and now Nim has to explain, in our domain, you don't touch, our head. And that's It's so interesting, those little, little details of as you said, kind of a complicated caste system where it's like, well, each, not just caste, but even domain, we have our thing. When the shamed ones and when Nomenor as the prophet, when he is talking about this stuff with the Jedi, lining it up with how the Jedi are favored by the gods, and the shamed ones certainly seem to believe that at this point. And Nen Yim is doing her sort of scientific work, and she's noticing parallels with mythology. It almost reminded me of like religious sort of syncretism of like when the Greeks were going to Egypt and they're looking at each other's myths and they're going, wait,
these are the same guys. Yeah.
Was that in your mind at all? That concept?
Yeah, sure. Bearing in mind though that there's behind it all, in this case, there is something real. Like there's a number Sakat and all that stuff. So there is a hidden reality, or a somewhat forgotten reality that they're uncovering. But yeah, I think this idea of this tendency to syncretize, like to see what you understand already in something that's a little alien, is normal tendency.
Yeah.
Right.
And I love that when Harar, he says something like Corran, like, it's an honor to be with the one who was shaped and the one who slayed Shadar Shai. This is like amazing. And then, Corran kind of goes, well, we're not top of the totem pole. There's Luke Skywalker, and they go, Luke doesn't really factor into our. I love that, just change in perspective. It's kind of interesting how that works. The way you wrote Shimra in Final Prophecy, it gave me such tremendous, like Genghis Khan, like almost this larger than life booming kind of man. Was that kind of, were you pulling from any kind of menacing, or was that just really from fiction? These figures that are larger than life, almost.
Honestly, at this point, I don't remember what I was thinking about Shimra. Actually, Genghis Khan was somebody that I got super interested in at a certain point in my life, mostly like my early 20s. And that whole situation, like the fact that Europe was, we all very nearly ended up speaking Mongolian.
And I have often felt, I think Walter John Williams might have made a little passing reference, but I have sometimes seen the New Jedi Order invasion as almost, it reminds me
a little like this, yeah.
The Great Horde, the golden, the Mongolian force. When you were writing the Yushun-Vong, I know you said you're pulling from Polynesian and Mesoamerican mythology and their naming conventions and their customs, but was that ever in your mind of the Mongol force?
I can't, probably not specifically, but there are lots of other kinds of empires that formed in the Mongols are the most spectacular example of it. But I was definitely thinking about that kind of thing. which has happened a number of times in history, right? And the way that you subjugate an area that's already civilized, right?
Yeah.
And part of that again comes from Mesoamerica, kind of reversed, because what the conquistadors found was that they could go into these places like Tenochtitlan, and they could thump off the guy at the top, and they could sit down in his chair, and the bureaucracy was already there for them, right? And so they didn't just wipe everything out and start over any more than the Mongols did, right? They looked at the existing structure and said, how can we use this? And then they did. And that same thing happened in South America when they toppled the Inca Empire. The Incas had this, empire that was running pretty well. And the Spanish saw no reason to screw with that. They just put themselves on the top of it. And it changed over time. But that's how initially they did it. I mean, that's how you do it when there are fewer of you. When you conquered an empire of millions, and there's like 50 of you, or 500 of you, or whatever.
There's a passage in Final Prophecy where Wedge is talking with one of the subordinates, and they're talking about Thrawn, and they're asking how would Thrawn have handled the Vong, and he's kind of giving his thoughts on that. And it's so fascinating because I had kind of came across Timothy Zahn talking about how he was approached to do 2 or 3 books for the series, and he turned it down because even though he liked the idea, he didn't want to work in somebody else's outline. But he said some very interesting things about what he would have done, and he wanted to emphasize how Thrawn, well, the Chiss were ready, but how Thrawn really would have, he was planning this, he was prepared for this, he would have found a way in on the Vong. And when I read that passage, having now known that, it was so interesting because even if he's not writing in the series, it came out in your book of this conversation that would have.
It's hard to, it's hard. For one thing, Zahn's, at that time anyway, was absolutely a fan favorite. I mean, there was no Star Wars author that was more, liked by the fans than Zahn, I don't think. I mean, some of the others came close, but Zahn was definitely number one. He was definitely somebody. I have talked to him in person since. I've been on panels with him and such, but I didn't communicate with him back then. But I did read, the Thrawn books, and you definitely needed to articulate with that, because it was part of that Star Wars, that expanded universe, and you want to make sure it's all of a piece as much as you can. That's the way I feel about it. So, but yeah.
There's a wonderful scene where the generals are all convening, and they're planning out sort of I don't know if I would say end game, but almost end game. They're trying to make their way into the core. They've got all these feints and little tactical things they're doing. And when they're there kind of plotting out what they're doing, they're thinking of how do we get to Coruscant eventually? Like we're not going there now, but we go to Bilbringi and we do all this. It almost reminded me of like meetings that I don't know a lot about, but I'm sure happened, where all the generals at the end of World War II they're thinking, okay, we got in Africa here, and we go up Italy here. How do we get into Berlin?
Yeah.
I mean, when you were writing those kind of war room scenes, do you draw on historical war stuff, or is this just?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, I'm not a military sci-fi guy, and I'm, whereas I do. Did anthropology and history, and most specifically ethnohistory. I'm not in any way a military historian, but I've read that stuff, right? So, of course, I was kind of trying to think, well, how would this likely happen, right? Like, how do you go about that? And a lot of the Star Wars authors are military science fiction writers. So the seeds for that stuff are already scattered through these earlier books anyway, right? So we already have some idea of how the generals in the Star Wars universe might think. So
it's almost like, you know, at this point they've become the Galactic Alliance, but I almost couldn't help but think of the Rebel Alliance and all these little it's almost like it's easier for them to fight as the underdog because they've got all these forces, you know, they have the Imperials they're working with, and they have all these different groups that are coming together. I found that so neat. I really liked the interactions. You know, Han finds it so awkward when he's talking to one of his fans. He has a fan in the Empire, but it turns out to be Pellaeon's son, which is really tragic that he dies. But I liked that. It's so just a crazy image. It's one of my favorite things about the series, that we have a unified galaxy. We have the Empire. You know, these TIE defenders are flying with the Falcon.
The Remnant,
it must have been surreal to write that, firstly, because even though we don't live in that world, we're so used to the movies where they're fighting the Empire.
Well, in the books too. I mean, like the Imperial Remnant, you know, is the subject of a lot of books, and the struggles against it, you know, and but you know, you could easily imagine all that happening, right? I mean, it's not going to happen easily. It's not going to happen without concessions. You know, but at a certain point, you know, when you've got an enemy that's kind of worse than your former enemies, you know, I mean, I don't think our alliance with Russia was necessarily a natural one in World War II, but it was necessary, right?
It reminds me of that as well.
Yeah.
You mentioned the readers who were the test readers, you know, they were reading to make sure that they captured like the voice of Han, for instance. And that's actually something I wanted to bring up. So when I was reading the Final Prophecy, this is very unexpected to me. I found myself laughing out loud at several scenes with Han and Corran, and it's this Corellian sort of attitude. And it's so interesting. You're so good at capturing just how people talk. And there was many points where, like, when Leia would say something, I'm just like, man, that is Leia. But there was almost that A New Hope kind of vibe of the snark and the atmosphere, which you captured so well. And I just wanted to ask in particular, was there something going through your mind when you're writing those scenes of Han and Corran, just kind of with that, I don't know, they have that skepticism, that snark, that they are different from the other characters and how they react.
I think you know, okay, so for one thing, I've written a number of, I'm kind of a bit partial to these kind of snarky, sarcastic, untrusting characters. I've written a number of my own. You know, the thing you also have to remember is that I was a Star Wars fan. I saw A New Hope in 9th grade when it came. I was in 9th grade, right? So it was a really important movie to me. I'd never seen a movie like that before. And I was a huge science fiction fan. I grew up reading science fiction. But I'd never seen a movie that appealed to me the way that, I mean, they hit me on all cylinders, right? So I was a big fan of that. And when I write any kind of character, though, any character, one of my own, I've written a book that's like got young Ben Franklin in it. I guess what I do is I create a working model of that person in my mind, and I let it run. And so more than anything else, when I start writing a specific situation, those models are running, and I'm like, well, and they sort of, I mean, it sounds a little schizophrenic, but they sort of do what they would do. That makes sense.
Ray Bradbury had a great quote where he said, you know, sometimes I write characters, but often they're telling me what.
Exactly. Yeah. And you know, I've argued with other authors about this. Who say like, yeah, that's not how it works. I'm like, for me, that's how it works.
Yeah.
You know, the first novel I ever wrote, The Waterborne, well, the first one that was published, I was writing this character and I had outlined the book. And I came to a point in the story where he was supposed to not get killed. Like he all of his friends were about to get killed, but he was going to escape. And I realized there's no way, the way I've been writing this guy, the way I know this guy now, as I've been writing him, that he would leave his friends to die. He just wouldn't do it. And that means there's also no way he can survive.
Right.
Yeah. So I had to figure something out that fixed both of those things. And it made for a completely different book and a much better book. So this idea of letting the characters kind of guide, especially when you've got characters like as iconic and as well known as the ones in Star Wars. I mean, it's actually not that hard to make the determination, like, this doesn't sound like Han right here. You know what I mean? If
Right.
you're a Star Wars fan, if you've seen the movies, it's not rocket science to know when the characters don't feel like those characters.
Right.
But it's also not something I can scientifically quantify. It's just something I kind of do.
Did you ever read any of the Matthew Stover books in the expanded universe, like Traitor or Revenge of the Sith?
Oh, sure, yeah.
You did? Okay. He has talked about how he was trained as an actor. So he really gets into that character voice. And that
right. Yeah, Matt's good at that too. He and I had a lot in common. We met face to face a number of times during that period. Not really to do it with playing the books. We just were in the same places at the same time.
Yeah,
I enjoyed his company. He's an interesting guy. Matthew Stover I got to know pretty well, mostly through conventions and stuff. I remember one a long horseback ride I had with him and some other people in Monterey. Because back then we'd go to these conventions and we'd all kind of get together and hang out for a few days.
Yeah.
And anyway, it was fun.
You got to write like Jaina solo in
Yeah.
Victory. What was it like writing that character? I really like, Jaina. She's all of the solo kids are so distinct. Anakin has his kind of heroic personality, and then Jason is very much the thinker, the philosopher. But then Jaina, which I've always loved, she is this kind of no nonsense, no BS person. I mean, what was your impression of Jaina, or still to this day? Like, how do you look at writing?
Well, pretty much what you just said. I know people kind of like her, so I often model fictional characters on people I also know in person. In fact, she's not unlike my wife in a lot of ways. But yeah, I enjoyed writing her. She was a fun character.
She really, through the series, she goes through what they used to call battle fatigue, which I think, post-traumatic stress. She goes through so much. And I think it's brought up to her at different points. And even in this book, someone says to her, I know your type. You're going to be out here until you get killed. But she's an interesting character because I don't want to say she's less spiritual or less Jedi. She's not, but she very much would be a pilot even if she was not a Jedi.
Right.
And reminds me a lot of Han, but I'm sure that's been
right. He's very pragmatic and nuts and bolts, and yeah.
Well, I have a question for you, Matt. And I tend to ask this to a lot of the Star Wars authors just because they all have a different answer. You keep saying, we're not allowed to do this, we're not allowed to do that, we can't kill this person, we have to ask permission for that first. First of all, do you like writing in the Star Wars universe? Secondly, do you feel like it inhibits you in any way to play in someone else's playground? And thirdly, if you could do whatever you wanted, what would you have done?
Well, I mean, yes to the first two questions. I did enjoy the experience of writing Star Wars. It was fun. I basically don't write things that I don't want to write. I'd rather work in a 7-Eleven if it came down to that. So yeah, I did enjoy it. Two, was it inhibiting? Yes, but so is a haiku.
So you don't feel it was inhibiting in a bad way?
No. I mean, I knew I was playing in somebody else's playground, and lots of other kids have played in before me. I mean, a little structure or a lot of structure can actually be helpful. I mean, if you don't have to make up the ground rules yourself, they're already there. And I've written other things where that was sort of the case, like my alternate history books. I'm starting with real history, so I'm constrained by that. even when I write fantasy, I'm constrained by the interior logic that I myself create. So it's not that big a deal. You know who I wanted to kill? I wanted to kill Wedge, but no. Okay,
You can't kill Wedge! Bad man! Bad! You kill Luke before you kill Wedge.
I didn't want to kill Wedge. I wanted people to think I'd kill Wedge. At the end of
kill Wedge.
at the end of a Final Prophecy, there's a ship going down in flames, and originally that was supposed to be Wedge, and we think, oh yeah, he's dead, and then he reappears in the next book. Because of people like you, they were afraid to even do that for fear that a
Wedge
mob
is
would
the
appear.
man. You can kill Chewbacca, you can't kill Wedge. Because if you'd killed Wedge, you'd have suffered Bob Salvatore's fate.
Yeah, even
and
worse.
gotten death threats
even
and
worse.
then some. He is such a cool
Oddly,
character.
nobody got annoyed about Ikra.
What would I do if I could do anything?
If you had no constraints.
Oh, I'd kill Wedge. No, I'm kidding.
I did ask. I deserved it.
And it would be just an accident too. He would just actually blink and fly his ship into
Slip in the shower.
telephone pole.
So nothing even great or wonderful. By the way, Wedge, he got a real bad case of the flu and died.
Yeah, there you go. I don't know. I've been asked, that's a question I've been asked before, and I don't.
Oh, really? I thought
Yeah.
I was being original.
That particular question, like what would you do next if you had your choice of anything in the Star Wars universe? So it wasn't exactly the same question.
Just trying to make me feel better.
Yeah.
Kill Wedge. That was a good answer.
Yeah, kill Wedge.
When you think about the Yuuzhan Vong, who all of their technology is essentially alive, you can start thinking about what's the basis for this? Like they've gotten this a bit twisted, but they must have started with something. At a certain point, I was involved in trying to figure out why they weren't in the Force. Like I was on a conference call with a bunch of people before I wrote my last book in the series. And this was after the prequels, obviously. So I said something about midichlorians, and it's like maybe they just don't have midichlorians. And they're like, oh, no, we can't mention, we will not speak of midichlorians.
Once they all get to Zona Masika, they have this incredible experience. Like coming to, again, it reminds me of the Aztec thing when they get to Tenochtitlan. I mean, before the city was there. And they get to that lake and they go, whoa, this is where we thought we would be. And it's amazing to me because did you read like Rogue Planet to prepare the zone? Because that planet was invented, I think, by Greg Bear in that novel. And then here way later, and
yeah, I did read that. Yeah. I definitely, I read most of the books in the New Jedi Order, the ones that led up to my book. And then when I got tapped to do Final Prophecy, I went back and read selected ones. So
what was that like? I mean, to write, it's almost like have you ever heard of this theory, like Gaia theory of like,
sure, of course. Yeah.
Right. So like it reminded me of that. I mean, when you're writing this living world, it's just so.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I've definitely read science fiction about other worlds like that. And yeah, of course, I was heavily influenced by the whole Gaia hypothesis, which I don't know that I buy into it. I mean, I tend to think the locus of evolution is situated with individuals and not with, by individuals, I don't mean me and you, but I mean individuals carrying genetic material, and not at the level of the ecosystem. I don't think ecosystems select their organisms. I think it's the other way around. Organisms build ecosystems, but there is a little of that second thing. I mean, because any organism that evolves inside of an ecosystem, and so you can think about them doing a job in it, right? And it's not hard to imagine, especially when you've got a guiding intelligence, a world that would be like Gaia, like that would literally be. I mean, we're talking about science fiction, right? So whether I think Earth is Gaia or not is kind of irrelevant. I can imagine a world like that.
I like that tidbit about the mass extinctions when it jumps, because even though I'm reading science fiction and fantasy, of course, I have a scientific part of my brain where I'm like, how would that work when you're in hyperspace and you drop out? Isn't that a jolt to that life system? And I liked that little detail where Nenyim is discovering that. And also, maybe this is in the weeds, but when she says, comparing the Yushin Vong biology and this biology, she says they have a different phenotype, but a very similar genotype. And I thought, that's so interesting, right? Because of course, if they're related.
Right.
So that, I have to give hats off to you for even putting that in there. But I understood it, and I thought it was very cool. And when my experience reading this series, maybe this was your experience when you were doing research for it, it was so neat to see this suddenly. I think maybe the writers felt this way, and maybe this is part of those meetings you guys had to finish it all. It's like, how are we going to wrap it up? And they said, well, there is this living planet, and that was such a surprising thing. You're like, oh, wow. It's that feeling where you go, it makes total sense, but then you go, did they plan this? Because it might have been a happy accident. I think it might have been, but it was great.
Yeah, I don't think that was not planned from the beginning. I can say that with certainty.
Yeah.
But it did shape up before we wrote the end.
So you would have known the ending when you're writing this, like what the next book's going to be.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Did you ever feel at any point, I wish I could write that one?
I was content to write the one I wrote because I wanted to deal with Nenyim in particular. And I knew she wouldn't be in the next one. So
was that something that they said, like, she's gone?
No, but I don't remember. But if they had offered me that one, that one, because the last one was in hardback, right?
Yeah.
Hardback is always like, ooh, hardback. But I had a number of hardback books, so but in Star Wars, I was not one of the hardback authors. I was one of the paperback authors, if you think about it, right there.
Yeah.
I was content to write the penultimate book, actually, to set
probably less things to pull together.
Right. Yeah.
I will say, for such a sprawling series, what you and Jim Lucino did to tie it all together was nothing short of incredible that you were able to do it. I mean, it's a sort of.
Well, there was a lot of, wasn't, like I said, there was a lot of working through that. There's a lot of talking about it, outlining it, figuring out what had to happen and what didn't, and other stuff like that. So, like, figuring out some key points that actually had been left ambiguous that we didn't even know the answer to.
Did you ever see the Japanese covers that they made of your novels?
Yes.
How beautiful these
absolutely. Yeah, I've got them in my bookshelf.
Real extraordinary. I mean, unbelievable.
Japanese covers are actually kind of my favorite Japanese covers are actually of my first two novels, The Waterborne and The Black God.
Right.
Because they first of all, they divided each book into two books. So The Waterborne is in two volumes.
Right.
The covers fit together, like they make one big picture.
Right.
Yeah, and and also the books are illustrated, like with these really kind of manga-looking pictures. So yeah, it's one of the great delights of being an author. Actually, is seeing, for me anyway, is seeing what happens with these foreign editions.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's weird, and sometimes it's amazing. But it's always kind of interesting. And, sometimes there's real money involved, and sometimes there's like the Czech rights, or the Polish rights. There's not much money involved there, but seeing something you wrote in Polish is very cool.
Yeah. And the quality of, I think it's Tyoshi Nagano's illustrations. I mean, I'll have there are people out there who have printed these things without the titles, the Japanese covers of your books.
Of course, yeah.
Have them on their wall.
Great, yeah.
Cool. Well, it's just been awesome talking with you.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Tonight, we are fortunate enough to have with us James Luceno. James, thank you for joining us tonight. I'm really glad to have you here.
Pleasure to be here. Good to talk to you.
Now, in the Unifying Force, you were chosen to write the finale novel in the series.
I think I was a natural choice only because I had been with that project from the very start, and I knew the characters, I knew the story arcs better than most of the writers who were involved. I mean, I think that there are any number of writers who would have, done a terrific job in wrapping that up. But I had all of that information at my fingertips, so I think I was a natural one to go to.
Yeah, I think you had said too that the second half of the series was almost more fun for you because you said everybody's creative impulses were really sort of contributing these new pathways. Is that how you feel about the series?
Yeah, although by the time we got to Forest Heretic, I was starting to wonder about tying it up, about tying up all the loose ends.
Bringing in all these species, the Yevata and the Sea Rook and all this amazing stuff. And
I mean, sometimes, these manuscripts would come in and it would be like, I would read them and go, to shake my head like, what? Where are we going now?
Was that fun to see that, or were you a bit worried that you couldn't stick the landing in the end?
No. It was fun. I didn't know, I got the commission to do Unifying Force very late. So I had no idea that I was going to be wrapping it up. So it was fun. Just, I was being taken on a journey with everybody else at that point. That's why when the Unifying Force came around, it was very strange.
Greg talked about how you guys convened again. I don't know if this was halfway through or towards the end. I know there were several meetings where you decided, okay, what do we need to do to make this work? The ending. Do you remember those meetings, like the second or third time when you come back and you say, all right, now how do we do this?
I do remember that at one point we were worried that the series was veering off course a little bit, that it was it was just being taken in directions that we felt like we couldn't control.
Right.
And so we kind of had to rein it in, but we still didn't have any clear idea of where it was going to go. I had no clear idea of where it was going to end, honestly. And I don't know when I finally figured it out. Probably after rereading every book again and seeing the path forward.
Sometimes that's the best way. You look at it and it comes to you over time, where you just it crystallizes. There's a word that Carl Jung came up with, constellated. Yeah, you feel like you constellate. So,
yeah, that's a great term. That's a great term.
It's funny, no one knew how this was going to work out, but somehow it did.
Right.
I believe Casablanca was made that way, but
that's true. They were writing the very day they were shooting. Yeah. I remember, my listing of all of the different plot lines that had been going through the series, and trying to figure out, I've got to really address all of these things if this is going to work, and try and try to figure out how these are all going to tie together. It was pretty crazy.
Was it difficult or tricky to pull it all together? I know you said you read everything. Was that a lot?
I don't remember that book being difficult. I was so in the flow, as I was writing, and also, when you're under a contract, that sort of helps. That sort of pushes you along. And I think, was I writing that during 9/11? Oh. I think I was. I think I remember writing, and Brian's wife actually called me and said, "Did you hear about what happened in New York City?" And so I'm sure that changed my thinking about what was going on.
Maybe it works. I'm speculating here, but if that was me and I'm writing that, I think I would feel, and maybe this is what you felt, now we've got to end things on a good note.
I think that may have happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To sort of counterbalance that. I know that was a thing that Star by Star came out right after 9/11. I mean, of course, they had no way to know.
Right.
But Fall of Coruscant in New York, it's crazy.
What sort of writing method do you use when you write a book? Like Troy Denning says he does a very structured plot when he writes.
I spend a lot of time telling myself the story, and I don't put anything down on paper until I could sit down with you and tell you the entire story. I might not be able to give you all the dialogue, and I don't know, certain twists I might not have worked out, but I spend a lot of time planning the story in my head, and then finally it's almost like I can't wait any longer. The dam bursts and I have to start working on the mechanics of actually getting it down on paper.
Do you still do an outline?
I do an outline at that point, just to kind of guide myself through the story that I'm going to take, and that outline I can, work with it, expand it, constrict it as necessary.
I am trying to write adult Star Wars, so I don't try and tailor my language or the plots to any particular age group. I know that the readership is broad. I get letters from 10-year-olds and I get letters from 60-year-olds. So I just write the novels the way I would in any piece of fiction that I worked on.
Well, I notice these are not easy to read novels in the sense that you might mention 50 planets, hundreds of characters, all the characteristics of, dozens of different species, and then we're kind of crisscrossing lots of different plot lines. And it does remind me of, and I saw in an interview, you mentioned one of your influences is Thomas Pynchon. It does remind me of that almost dense style where, you're dealing with a galaxy here. So galaxies aren't simple. Just like he would deal with these enormously dense, complicated plots, the actual style of the writing has to be equally, dense and kind of, complicated. And that's what's happening in your books, I notice.
I've tried to make that galaxy far, far away as real as possible. I have been criticized for using, too many references. Those books are very difficult to get into. In fact, if you're not a Star Wars fan, I've had, a lot of friends say, I tried to read your book and I gave up after the second page.
Does that suck when someone says that?
No, because I totally get it. Because, these books are set in an alternate universe. And if you haven't, there's no easy entry point. So now, 20 years of publishing, you've got to come to these books with a little bit of knowledge of the universe. We're all trying to make an attempt now to simplify it a bit, to make these books and some of these side projects a little bit more accessible to new readers. But there's a really hardcore fan base that will call me on every mistake. So I've got to be very careful, and I try to write. I try to write a little bit to that fan base. I want the ones who've been loyal readers to really get the most that they can out of the books.
Well, because life itself is complicated, and you're dealing with all these issues of not only this mystical power of the Force, but kind of empire politics and economics and, the relationships between different species. There's really very, very few ways I can imagine that you simplify it without it becoming childlike.
Yeah, definitely don't want to make it childlike. But it is interesting to me that, you look back at A New Hope, back in 1977, which was, kind of a pulp science fiction adventure, and just where this franchise has come since then. So many things were hinted at in those first three films that it enabled, we writers and other people have contributed to just continue to flesh out this universe and make it almost a living thing.
Can you describe some of the specific research you did to get all this pulled together?
Well, I've always read everything I can get my hands on related to Star Wars. I mean, I read all the novels, I read the comics, I read the Wikipedia entries. I generally like to, keep myself really up on what's going on in the franchise, in the universe.
And, it's interesting that I wrote the Bible and broke it down. I had the 5 major books and then all the fill-in books, and it was all laid out. But in a series like that, it was interesting to watch it sort of spiral out of control because it was in the beginning, I got to weigh in on everybody's manuscript, but as the series progressed, there were certain writers that didn't want another writer looking over their shoulder. So like now, it would have been better if I was really the showrunner, like where everybody's script, went through, not necessarily me, went through one person. So there was like a guiding vision through the whole series. But people, and I don't blame them, they wanted to take things in their own direction. Okay, here's the framework. Now I'm going to spin it off into. So it was always wrangling, trying to bring all the books, make them cohesive. And that was a little frustrating in the end, So the Yuuzhan Vong, they became something that I hadn't really envisioned in the beginning. But I like what everybody added. So in the end, we ended up with a cool product, a cool, invasion scenario, cool villains. But a lot of that stuff was just organic. It just happened as the series rolled out, like the Yuuzhan Vong.
It's interesting how you say, in a modern situation, you kind of be the showrunner, because I think a lot of fans do see you as the showrunner of NJO. I mean, more than any other one.
To be honest, so I wouldn't say it got into be a battle, but as the series progressed, I had to run my ideas with Shelley Shapiro's ideas. And we weren't always in sync about where we wanted the series to go. So I was glad that I got to do the Unifying Force, because then I was able to kind of bring it back to where I had imagined it. But there was a period of time there where I just didn't have as much say as I had in the beginning.
Well, I can assure you that I believe every person I've ever come across has nothing but positive things to say about Unifying Force. In fact, I have even read detractors, people who weren't on board this series, who will say, I wasn't enjoying it. I still read every book. But that last book, somehow it brought it all together. And, that's not a perspective I relate to, because I loved the whole series. So, I mean, I loved everything. But that is a testament to your ability to pull together all those things.
I don't know. I think my talents as a writer are somewhat limited, but what a talent I do have is an ability to just hold a lot of information in my head for whatever reason. So, I mean, I think that's why I was brought in to begin with, because I had done the same thing with this Robotech franchise. And so with the Unifying Force, I just had all this stuff in my head when I went into the book. And I mean, I reread everything before I even jumped into writing a page of that book. But I was just deeply invested in the story. And so, I had all of that, to work with.
And you said, bringing it full circle, that heart, the heart of the story is so strong, I think, that sticking that landing, which somehow you were able to do, it, I think it makes the earlier stuff fit better to have an ending. Even though NJO puts everybody through the ringer, it ends on such a hopeful note, and everybody is on the same page. And then, we'll talk about it, but Jason's journey, I mean, I know you were thinking of it as I think you said before you wanted to kind of wrap it up, and a lot of people see it that way.
Yes, I did want to end the expanded universe with the unifying force.
Yeah.
Very selfish of me. Very selfish of me, keeping a lot of writers from work, you know. But I mean, it's like I kept thinking, like, these television series like Cheers or Seinfeld, like, you can't have these characters go on forever. Eventually things start to deteriorate. You want to go out, you want to try and go out on a high note.
I think in a way your goals there to make it all fit, you won in the end, because I can't tell you, I do look online and see what the fans are saying, new fans, old fans, and it's probably not a week that goes by without somebody coming in and going, hey, I'm a new reader. I just started reading the Star Wars books. Tell me which books in the Bantam era I should read, because my goal is the NJO. Everybody now, and that's so funny.
Is that right? Oh, that's funny.
Nowadays, people see it as the destination, the sort of the, I mean, for lack of a better word, a lot of fans see it as the capstone. So yeah. The New Republic goes through the ringer and it comes out as the Galactic Alliance. Mm-hmm. And I know that GFFA thing was, I'm sure that was on purpose, Galactic Federation of Free Alliances or whatever it is.
Right.
And, you got Boris Thalia always being just a son of a bitch in everybody's side. Mm-hmm. What was that treatment sort of democracy and how it works and how it gets muddled in politics and how it resolves? I mean, what was your thought of that throughout the series? Because that was really something that was a constant theme.
Yeah. Again, it goes back to this notion of there being multiple sides to issues. And how are you always sure you're making the ethical choice when you move forward? And the culture clash idea, like, is it okay to exterminate an enemy entirely?
Yeah.
Is there room for forgiveness? Is there some way to forgive in the end? These things, they're big ideas, but they're fun to play with in a science fiction setting like that. It's interesting. I mean, there seems to be a difference in Western literature versus Eastern literature in terms of villains. In Eastern philosophy, there's always a sense that in the midst of the bad, there's a little good. In the midst of the good, there's a little bad. So the heroes and villains you come across in Eastern literature is very different than Western literature. And I'm wondering if in some ways when we create a villain with a backstory where there's motivation, where we see the cause, are we always writing about Satan? Satan, Lucifer, started out as an angel and fell from grace and decided in the end that he knew, or he knows, that he can't defeat God, but what he can do is he can ruin God's creation. So is he do you think he's kind of the archetype for a lot of the villains that have come down in literature? Yeah. So I do think in some sense there's, in Western tradition, there is a little bit of the devil in every villain, in the same sense that there's, that when we write bad guys, we're often, our archetype has become the Nazis. I'm really trying to come up with ways to investigate the nature of evil rather than just splash evil on the page. Anybody can come up with like a series of horrible acts and create a villain that's just beyond redemption and just a total barbarian. But that doesn't really interest me. I really want to know about the shades of gray there. I like the origin stories. I think that I've always been fascinated by psychology and sociology and some other things. So I like exploring these origins and trying to think, how did he get there? So that's the interesting part for me.
Do you think writing villains has affected you as a writer?
I think that I had to get past the notion of accountability
in creating villains that are what I would say is the heroes of their own story, was I really orchestrating these stories to make people admire evil, and I had to get past that in order to really get comfortable with the notion of exploring evil in a fictional way. I had the fortune of writing about Han and Luke in the New Jedi Order, so it was interesting to write about heroes, the good guys. I think as a writer, it's interesting to be on the other side and to be able to devote as much attention to the bad guys.
Why do you think people like to read about bad guys?
Well, I really don't have a firm answer, and I think that it's different in different circumstances. I think in some cases there are villains that we want to see brought down because we want to see a hero who can be even more clever, who can overcome the chaos that the villain has introduced. The villain brings out the highest qualities in the hero.
What are some essential characteristics for a good villain?
Well, this is something I'm still grappling with, and I've really made like a study of villains in literature. I think that what I've understood is that a villain has to be even more fleshed out than a hero. In fact, I came across this quote by C.S. Lewis, who said that a villain is easier to write because even the best of us can't imagine what it's like to be heroic, even on our best days, to perform acts of heroism. But to write a villain, all you need to do is dig down deeply into your baser instincts and let those surface on the page, and you've got your villain.
And then there's Shimra, who, he's the big bad. I got to say, Shimra always reminded me of Genghis Khan. But by the way, was there any Mongolian influence with the Vong?
Yeah, I thought a little bit about that.
Onami is revealed as this. He's the real dude.
That was really fun to pull that little trick at the end.
I was gonna ask, was that planned from the start? Because
I had that in mind early on.
Okay.
Early on, yeah.
Were you the one that came up with the idea that the main villain was just a puppet?
Yeah, that goes back to the original story arc. In the very, very earliest meetings, that was always there.
Now, I seem to remember you saying somewhere else that George had a comment on Onami. He said something about him being dwarfish or some description that.
Oh, I think he was really opposed to that. That it felt demeaning. Yeah, there was something that went on there, like don't do that. Why would you give him those characteristics? That's just yeah. I do. That's funny. I hadn't thought about that in a long time, but I do remember that.
What about that guy? I forget his name, but he was always sort of that other big villain, and he ended up in that disintegrating spaceship at the end. The one who was the prophet for that Yuuzhan Vong religion, and essentially the big con man throughout the entire series.
Oh, Nomenor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it true he's coming back?
I haven't heard those rumors.
So you intended him to Nomenor to be dead?
I did, but that doesn't mean that he can't be resurrected.
Okay.
Sherlock Holmes was, so I mean, where Moriarty was. I mean, people, if there's a reason to bring him back, somebody will.
One other thing comes from my Star Wars fan club. They were curious about how you sent off the main villains of the series in the Yuuzhan Vong. You chose they killed I think 365 trillion people as the final death count.
The number of dead, I think I may have actually got that off the internet somewhere. I don't know where that number came from. I think I relied on someone else's calculations for that.
They sort of mostly had their weapons taken away and then were sent off to go their merry way. Did you decide to go for the merciful option, or was that from above, or what?
Well, I don't think they went their merry way. They were sort of, in a way, they were were exiled, and with the idea that they would begin to sort of become a different people or become a different species in the end if they're on Sonoma Sakot. It wasn't something that came from the top, although it was something that a lot of us discussed, and whether we should just wipe out this enemy or do something that was a little bit less cliche. So we agreed that it would be an interesting option to have everybody take a more peaceful approach to solving the problem, a more peaceful resolution.
I kept thinking about Mesoamerica too, when just, Europeans just wiped out so many. There seemed to be no room there was no reconciliation. There was no embracing of another culture. Let's just stamp it out. Let's exterminate it. I mean, it's still going on, right?
Right. And it's almost like this is like, well, what if there were these Zen Jedi masters there to find another way?
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a tantalizing idea for any of us who like both cultures.
Right. Right.
Was that always your feeling that the series should end with that sense of almost like a redemption or an uplift?
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted it to go that way.
With the exception of like the Hutts or the Peace Brigade, it's what it does for the galaxy when the Vong come. Yeah. Everybody goes, okay, we might have had our differences, but
come together on this one. Yeah.
Was that your thinking too, to unify the galaxy through this means?
Yeah. That was in the early. I remember that being in the Bible in terms of the arc of how everybody was going to come together. That just made sense. I mean, whether it's World War II or Cortez gathering all the enemy of the enemy,
It sort of fits with the series too, because I have sometimes thought to myself that the Aztecs might have been in trouble even without the conquistadors, because they were so hated by the surrounding peoples.
That's why they lost in the end, I mean, Cortez saw it, this group has enemies, if we could just get all their enemies together. Yeah.
And I think the Shamed One revolution is almost as class conscious as Star Wars ever got.
Mm-hmm.
That you have this. I mean, was that in your thinking as well when you're working on that revolution?
Yeah. Having grown up in the 60s, that all played into it. Yeah.
It works so well. And in a lot of ways, it's a full circle moment. I love that, just like in that original film, you have that. And then also familiar faces, R2 and 3PO there, sort of commenting like the Greek chorus in the films, where they're kind of, man, hopefully things are not as exciting as this ever again. You had a great job with the character arcs and somehow keeping that in mind, because I think they're on Zona Masikat and Kip Duran was there with all these Jedi, and I think all their amphistaffs and all their weapons kind of flee into the forest or something. Mm-hmm. And Kip is the first one to put down his lightsaber and offer that hand. And that's and then also simultaneously you got Mara has her great duel with Nomenor, who poisoned her way at the start. These giant arcs and putting that cap on that. Well, I mean, firstly, that's quite a progression for Kip, and then for Mara to finally get her reckoning. What was it like bringing that? It's like you have a 70-piece orchestra doing a 6-hour suite, and then in the last 30 minutes we got to bring it all. What was that like?
Yeah, those are just moments when you're writing when you don't see them coming, but writers talk about how characters speak to them, or say things that like you didn't expect them to say. So a lot of that happened during that book, where it was taking on a life of its own, and like how nice to be able to see characters come full circle or finally do something that goes even beyond what you expected of them. So it just felt terrific to be able to do that.
In the Unifying Force, Luke pretty much just goes out and pretty much goes to the main villain's stronghold and wastes him like it's no tomorrow. That's pretty different from the previous books all to there where Luke was kind of vacillating. Did you decide to change Luke's portrayal there, or was just enough enough?
I think it was a combination, but I mean that was the Luke that I think was missing from a lot of the series. I mean, by then, by the time that Unifying Force came along, we'd been getting plenty of feedback about the portrayal of certain characters. So it was important to remind everyone, I guess, that Luke is the main man when it comes to these things. So I was really happy that I got to kind of bring him back to where a lot of people wanted him to be.
Some fans have speculated that Luke was using Vatpad, which is a prequel of fighting form.
Yeah.
In the final novel. Do you think that's possible? Or did you write it with that intent?
Yeah, although I mean that's a good explanation sort of after the fact, because I don't think Shatterpoint had been written then, and I don't remember talking with Matt about any of that. I could be wrong, but I like the explanation.
In the Unifying Force, what did Luke use to kill the Slayer? It was described in the book as green sparks, but since this hasn't really happened before, we were wondering.
Wow, let me think. Let me dwell on that for a minute, because I really can't remember.
I halfway expected that, but I figured I'd ask it just since.
Yeah. If it occurs to me during the course of our conversation, I'll get back to that.
There was a lot of internet buzz going around there that Unifying Force would feature another huge death, which didn't really materialize. Was that just all fan speculation, or did anyone at Del Rey really contemplate offering another one of the major characters?
That had to have been fan speculation, because there was never a plan to offer another major character. I mean, I tried to to sort of toy with the idea that Han was going to die there in the book, but no, that was never a part of it.
Was killing off characters part of your vision?
No. I mean, when we had the original discussions, when we were talking about the New Jedi Order early on, we sort of jointly arrived at a decision that Chewbacca would die. We weren't really interested in killing off principal characters, and really in the Unifying Force, I didn't want to kill them off. I wanted to give the sense that their story had been told, and then they could go off into their kind of retirement. In the same way that some television shows do that, like whether it's Cheers or Seinfeld or whatever else, you just get a sense that you've seen. You've been able to stick with these characters for a certain part of their life, and then they go on to whatever else.
There's a lot of philosophy, not just in the series, but in Unifying Force. Do you have a lot of philosophical background? Are you interested in that, to bring that in?
I don't have any degrees, but I've always had a strong interest in all religions and philosophy, and just trying to find your way through this mess.
I want to ask about Jason. He ended up being my favorite character by the end of the series. He goes through that journey. At first, he's kind of on the more pacifistic, kind of obstinate. But then as time goes on, and this partly through Traitor and Destiny's Way, he goes through this incredible journey. I wanted to ask you, to me, his journey, especially through that latter half of the series, he's almost moving towards a kind of enlightenment, like a kind of a bodhisattva.
Yes.
And I was going to ask about kind of like maybe those Eastern influences in his arc of kind of this Buddhist or Taoist figure. Was that in your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely felt like by the end of the Unifying Force that he would be the one to recognize something beyond what the Jedi had even envisioned as the Force, that he would move past it. So, almost not a religious figure, but an enlightened figure. So that's where I wanted to take him all along. But I like the idea of seeing before that, though, I liked keeping characters kind of in this gray space where that's why you mentioned this culture clash, that the whole thing was going to be kind of gray, like what side do we come down on here? There's two sides to everything.
Yeah. That one, when he experiences that oneness and he says, I'm experiencing this. I know I'll never reach it again, but I'm here now. I mean, that it sounded like almost a description of that Nirvana moment.
Yeah, I think I was also thinking of Tolkien, where it was sort of, I don't know whether I was thinking of Frodo or Bilbo, something like, you would have a moment that, and I mean, this is talked about in mystical literature too, where you're not going to hit this plane, you're not going to be in this space again, but you'll take the memory of that with you for the rest of your life, and that'll be enough to nurture you.
Yeah, it's like when you're in Mount Doom only once, dropping the ring.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, I actually had a friend of mine who wanted me to ask you that, if the Lord of the Rings influence, if there was any.
I was thinking in those terms.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
When you in there, you talk about the Force. Can you talk about what you had in mind for the unifying force? Because it kind of reminds me, when George has talked about it, he talks about the cosmic force, something that's sort of larger than yourself, something that's, like you said, it's almost a vision of the world, it's just a full spectrum view. I mean, what was your thought when you're writing that?
I don't think I came up with the term unifying force. I thought that came from something that George said at one.
Yes.
Am I right?
He changes his terms, but I think he described it as cosmic or unifying. That wasn't mine. That wasn't mine. But yeah, but the notion was that that the Jedi had sort of held themselves back from really realizing the full potential of the Force. Right. Yeah. Okay. See, that makes a lot of sense to me, because that sort of full spectrum view, I love. I love that notion of enlightenment. Like I said, the series kind of inspired me personally to look at that, because there was nothing cooler than being 15 or 16 and going, wait, there's real Jedi Masters? Like, they're not Star Wars.
And that's very Eastern too, right? I mean, it is very, embracing the black and white as one whole, one balancing act,
Yeah.
So, what actually is the difference between the dark side of the Force and the light side of the Force?
I wish that George Lucas could be the third party in this conversation to really tell us the truth. I mean, I think it has to. What George has said is that the difference between the two is that the light side of the Force, for lack of a better term, is about compassion. So this is one of the reasons why a Dark Lord could never survive death in the way that some of the Jedi do. Yoda, Obi-Wan, even Anakin. Because there was this bit of compassion in all of them.
But then, in Darth Plagueis, you mentioned also they're trying to explain, the Sith Lords are trying to explain the differences, and you suggest that the light side is more about kind of submission to the flow of the Force, almost like a Taoist sort of approach, whereas the Sith Lords are trying to enhance their abilities to control this universal power.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it is very Taoist in that sense. Feeling the Force and being in tune with the Force is the light side. Trying to manipulate the Force for your own ends will take you to the dark side.
When you had the Tao of the Force book.
Yeah, before Tim's on. I was working on that at the same time, which George just shot down.
Now that thing, I mean, I was going to come to this later, but the Tao, I feel that NJO has a lot of Taoist philosophy, especially in the second half, and Zen Buddhist stuff. I mean, you're the one you're with the Tao of the Force way back yonder, and then you wrap it up with Unifying Force. Do you see a connection there with that philosophical outlook, or?
Yeah, I mean, I eventually, I got to use some of the stuff that had been thrown out the window earlier on.
So it got in there.
I think really George relented after a while, because he signed off on a lot of those Force books that are, he said, "Oh, I never want to make this a religion," but in a way, he abandoned that a little bit.
Well, and in the films, I mean, I think the extent to which you extend it is natural from my perspective from the films,
right?
Because he was thinking that, certainly,
right?
Yeah. So
I was too early,
Yeah. I think Elaine Cunningham said, "If you want to write fantasy, study religion and philosophy."
Mm-hmm.
Great advice.
Yeah, and anthropology too helps.
Greg Bear, you brought in his planet, which he made, Zona Masicet, and I just recently was talking with Greg Keyes. Greg was telling me how inspired he was by the Gaia hypothesis of this.
Yeah, I remember him talking about that a lot at the meeting. Yeah.
Really? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. He came in with some really strong ideas, about what he wanted to do. He had it pretty fleshed out in his mind, even before we sat down.
And, Sean Williams and Shane Dix had done a lot of amazing work with that planet in the Force Heretic books. That idea that Zona Masicet enters the orbit of Coruscant, and there is this incredible scene, which is straight out of, it's not even more recent science fiction, it's more like classics, sort of all this amazing stuff. Like, did you come up with that resolution, or to use that?
Yeah, I did. Like I said, I was like so in the flow when I was doing that I was just, I don't know. I was, sometimes you can't figure out how your mind is working, but I was just grabbing ideas. Yeah, I certainly didn't see that ending coming.
It's like I think you were in the Jason oneness situation.
I think I was. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. I mean, sometimes the best work, and we're both musicians, it's that way.
It's true. Yeah, it's true. I mean, you hear about musicians saying, they sat down and wrote a song that becomes a hit like in 2 minutes. It just sort of like happened. They didn't plan it, just came out of them, right? And they would talk about this magic where you can't pin it down, you can't teach it. It seems to come from somewhere else.
Writing that final scene, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say that they've got tears on the page, and it's just, they can hear the music.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what a writer would love to hear, and I mean, it was a moment even for me, again, that was one of those things that I didn't see coming, but it needed to close big. It needed to close on an emotional note.
Yeah, I can still remember that sort of their laughter going up through the echoing up into the sky, and and then after that, I think you kind of disappeared to go build a hut or something.
You did.
Did that work? Did you succeed at that?
No, I did learn a lot about how to do thatched roofs, but I never actually pulled off doing an entire structure.
I couldn't help but notice Jason is ready to set off on a voyage to learn throughout his 20s, voyage all different people. And you may know somebody who voyaged throughout his 20s and met different people. Was there any of you in that, Jason?
It might have been a little bit. Yeah. I mean, see, that would have been interesting. That was an interesting notion to me, like where Jason might have gone after the series. I thought that there was a lot of room there to turn Star Wars into something even, bigger than it was or different than it was.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether I talked to Shelley about that or I ever pitched that to her, but I would have liked to have had a shot at that.
Another Unifying Force question. Did you intend Jacen Solo from that point on to be like Luke's successor? He's Han Solo and Princess Leia's son, for fans who don't know the series.
Not really.
Oh, really?
No, I I think initially in that book, I wanted him to be the Jedi that goes off on a kind of knight's errand, or just goes off on a quest and begins to learn from other groups who use the Force in different ways, and that I never saw him as Luke's replacement.
I was most interested in Jason's period following the New Jedi Order, going to be going around the universe and gathering knowledge from other Force users.
Do you see him as someone who, when he's out there, does he come home from his journey and become the Grand Master, or does he kind of keep going out there into this kind of Qui-Gon space where he's just different for the rest of his time?
You know, I don't know. I don't have any fixed idea about that. That would be something, you know, interesting that would come out in the creation, you know, of that. Yeah. In fact, now that I'm thinking of it, there was a whole section of Unifying Force that was cut where I had Jason going out and doing that very thing, meeting with different groups and, you know, taking or giving what he could. And Shelley thought it was slowed the book down, or it was too philosophical or something. So it was cut out.
So that would have been towards the end.
Yeah.
I like how you set everyone else on their path. I think some of the pilots are retiring, and you know, Luke has that interesting conversation towards the end where he says, I think he's in communication with Harar and some of these Yushin Vong guys, and they're kind of like, is this the last time we're going to see you? And Luke's like, maybe not. Could it be that maybe in the future he would go and see how his old Vong buddies are doing?
Right.
And the end of the series, the Yushin Vong are really set up in a good place, better than they have been for a while. You may not have had more than just a sketch in your mind, but how do you picture sort of the Vong? What potential do they have as a people to go forward?
I don't think I ever really gave that serious thought. I mean, I wanted to plant the idea with so that readers could, you know, just imagine where that culture or how that culture might evolve into something. But I didn't pin anything down. I didn't nail it down in any way.
I like that setup. Did you always envision Jaina and Jag getting together? Because at the end they split up, but it seems temporary.
Yeah, and no. That sort of evolved as the series evolved. You know, that seemed to be the way it was. It wasn't something that I thought of in the beginning.
Okay, so that was a relationship that just sort of happened.
Right. You know, there's characters just getting together. You know, who would have thought?
Yeah, and I remember you had posed those possible, you know, that you basically said that your job was done now, but there's other stories to tell, and who knows what'll happen in the future.
Right, you always want to leave that open. But you know, that's also a danger with you know, with franchises. There may be, I think there's a point that every franchise reaches where, you know, have we now told enough? You know, how much more time are we going to spend in this world? You know, when I think of you know, Babylon 5 or Battlestar Galactica, I do like series that wrap up. I don't know that that's ever going to happen with Star Wars, although I tried to wrap it up with the Unifying Force. I think there's been like 30 books published since that. You know, I think there's a point where, you know, you really are stretching. You're really stretching things to find story. Everyone's scratching their head trying to figure out are there places where stories haven't been told. You know, as far as I'm concerned, there aren't any. I mean, Han Solo and Luke have been taken just about everywhere at this point.
You do want to protect the legacy of your characters in some ways. You know, you don't want to constantly be throwing stuff at them because, like we talked about earlier, it's bound to turn and bite you. You know, It's not going to work out.
Well, was that, by the way, was that the thinking? I mean, you felt that way, but I know I have gone back to see what they were thinking. And Shelley and Sue used to pop online on the forums, and people would be asking them, are there ideas for sequels? And they go, even as late as 2002, they're thinking, we have no thought of a sequel to this. I mean, was it always kind of that thinking that this is
there was nothing. There was really, the next series came out of more story group gets together and starts throwing ideas and come up with something. But no one knew where it was going to go.
I know some people who they're fans, but they like to write. And there are people who would like, different people write different continuations. And I think some of these guys are thinking of writing a kind of a continuation of NJO as if it was 2004.
Oh, I'd love to see that. I'd love to see it.
Well, they were wanting me to ask you, not necessarily something concrete, but are there directions that you would have said, check that place out, or this character?
No, not really. I would be, that's one of those situations where I would welcome anything. I would love to see where people would take that. It's almost like, if somebody decided that The Sopranos had more life, where is it going to go?
I've always considered myself, when I do these sort of tie-in adaptations, whatever you want to call them, I consider myself kind of a fan fiction writer. It's just that my books have the imprimatur of, say, Lucasfilm or of Harmony Gold. But there are many people faced with having to close the Robotech saga, might have done something very different than what Brian and I did in End of the Circle. So it's a funny situation, especially in a franchise where every fan, every reader kind of feels ownership of a sort. And, you just have to really focus on that franchise and focus on the fan base and get a sense of what everybody would really like to see happen and do your best to fulfill that.
Yeah, and you did a book tour for Unifying Force. What was that like?
Oh, I love those book tours. Just feeling like an important person for a change, being picked up at the airport and staying in nice hotels and then talking to people who are enjoying your book. It was great.
Do you have a favorite title of the ones that you've written? Or does each one have its own beauty?
I think each one poses its own challenges, and each one, some are more difficult than others. The book that wrapped up the New Jedi Order series, The Unifying Force, I think was one of the most interesting for me to work on.
So what would you say has been so far your favorite Star Wars scene or character to write?
For me, two scenes stick out. The first was in Dark Lord, when Anakin was sort of still transitioning to Darth Vader, just trying to imagine what it was like for Anakin to wake up in that suit, which was now keeping him alive. So I really enjoyed writing that scene. I also had fun in the New Jedi Order, just having the Jedi finally be able to take back Coruscant after a long war.
I think that's the Star Wars sensibility. That even after The Empire Strikes Back, there's always a note of hope. Lucas was never out to write a downer saga, and so I had to keep that in mind. That there has to be some glimmer of light left somewhere. We know it has a happy ending.
What particular messages or themes about the Star Wars saga resonate or speak to you?
Well, to me, it's the myth of the hero's journey. The reluctant protagonist who gets kind of dragged into a quest that he has very little understanding of in the beginning of his adventure, and just the unfolding of that path and the knowledge that's gained along the journey. I've always been a sucker for that.
It has been just the best talking with you, Ben.
Likewise.
So thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Bye.
See ya.
Now that the NGO, the New Jedi Order series, is over, what did you think about the finale?
It was sort of a real feeling of pride at seeing the series finish that well.
Okay.
Did you like the endings? Were you happy with the endings?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like it. I like it.
Yeah. So much had changed while we were writing Force Heretic that I was surprised at how neatly it did tie up and how much it did sort of match my expectations. Always when novels are written, there are details and riffs that stray from a synopsis and always surprise. But I thought that the last two books were just terrific. I really enjoyed it. And it had to be good. I mean, the series was so huge and people had so much invested in it. And not just the fans, but the authors and the editors, and it really had to be a great ending, and I think they pulled it off.
How did you appreciate the NGO main story now that it's over?
Oh, I really loved the NGO main story. I thought that it was a real risk for Del Rey to go that way and to do something a little bit darker, and I think it worked perfectly. It brought a little element of uncertainty back to Star Wars, well, a big element of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And I think that was just what it needed to give it the edge that it needed to continue progressing as a series. I understand from booksellers and so forth that the NJO is quite a hit.
Yeah.
And I was very happy to be a part of it, even though I only was able to write one book in it.
I got to tell you, that was the most fun I've ever had writing a book in terms of working with other people, because it was just a wonderful experience. All of the authors that I dealt with, at least, and I think that probably is true for all of the authors, were very cooperative, very eager, and very enthusiastic about the projects. We spent many, many long hours on email and on the phone and going back and forth saying, oh, we got to do this, we got to do that, and kind of working out the little details between where their stories would end and what their characters were doing in their stories versus where they needed to be in mine. It was a lot of fun. It was like collaborating with 10 best friends to do a story.
There were meetings. I mean, they flew a bunch of us into San Francisco to go to Lucasfilm to have these meetings to talk about this stuff. There were at least two of them I know of, and then I know from Aaron Alston, there were yet more meetings that continued this sort of stuff. So, I mean, people were spending a lot of money to get people together to try and make a series that was going to be different. And again, when you look at what Bantam was doing, then you look at what Pocketbooks have been doing with Star Trek for so long and what all the TV tie-ins were, the New Jedi Order was actually unbelievably ambitious. It underwent some changes from our original plan, and I think that weakened it a little bit, but it was incredibly ambitious. You haven't seen people risk this sort of stuff with their property, and it's a valuable property. And that was one of the coolest things about working for Lucasfilm on all of these things, is that they would actually trust us as creative individuals to do things, and they would believe that we actually knew what we were doing. And that was fairly cool. I mean, it's great when you have a company like that saying, yeah, go ahead, we trust you.
My philosophy, in terms of I've worked with a lot of very talented and creative people, is to let the creative people do their job. I may have an opinion, but, and I'm lucky that my opinion is usually respected because I've been there, done that, and I kind of know what it is that they're doing. People that don't know anything about it, as far as I'm concerned, shouldn't be telling creative people what to do. It's the absolutely wrong way to go about things. It's exactly like the Pope telling Michelangelo how to paint his ceiling. It's just not the way to do it. So I know both sides of it, but I still look at it from the creative side.
It was fun. Like the New Jedi Order thing was completely fabulous because it was just publishing. Once you throw games and other people into the mix, it becomes a lot more difficult because you have more people. And also everything I ever did with the games group Those guys are brilliant and I love them, but our books would get done way before they finish their game and we'd have to sit around with our hands. When can we publish? We can't publish yet because they're delayed or they're whatever.
Talking about the New Jedi Order, that group of authors, because again, that group is so talented in itself and telling that pretty broad story.
You've got a new editor and you've got new blood and you've got new writers. That thing just took off. It was great. It was a lot of fun.
That series, it was 19 books in a row on the New York Times bestseller list. I mean, can you speak to the success of NJO? Did that surprise you guys?
Yeah, happy surprise. We didn't know out of the box whether we knew that there was a huge fan base out there, but not everything sticks to the wall. So we were pretty happy. And there's a huge fan base, of couple 100,000 people, and if they're going to be buying books, that's great.
Was there ever a sense of anxiety of having a book like Traitor or Dark Journey where it's not featuring anyone from the films, it's just featuring a wholly created character?
I thought that was great, and unexpected. I didn't think that any writer would come in with that notion of just having a sort of singular book. But I thought that was fantastic that it worked out that way. And I think the worry in the beginning was some people felt like the Bantam books, that may have ended the franchise. So there was no sense that readers were going to come back to Ballantine, come back to yet a new version, a new like I said, phase 3 of the franchise. So it was a worry. So then when books started making the bestseller list, everybody's like, it's thrilled.
That must have been cool for you to have your books on the bestseller list.
Are you kidding? That was fantastic. I mean, and it's funny that, as a writer, early on in the 70s, you might get a review or two, or you might, something in Locus magazine or something. And then by the time the NJO comes along, everybody in the world is weighing in, you know what you're doing right and you know what you're doing wrong,
I think they had newspapers putting Chewie in the obituaries section and, different newspapers.
Right.
And
whole different time.
It must have been, I mean, even looking through that now, they're talking about Anakin Solo and Washington Post. What the hell is going on? But
that was a thrill. It was a thrill. Like hearing your record on the radio, hearing a song you made on the radio.
We had a great time in the New Jedi Order. It was the most incredible experience. Something I certainly don't get to work on very often as an editor. But it was also a little unwieldy. Of course, it was 19 books, not 9.
Do you ever fill it in? I feel this is too dark.
The simple answer to that is that in Star Wars, there's sort of a definition of where you can go. I mean, and I think you look at the movies and you see real blood and gore kind of violence doesn't really make it in Star Wars. Not that it has to be handled off screen, off camera, but you're just never going to start to describe. As soon as you get into describing blood and gore, broken bones, bodies laying all over the place, I think you're in a different franchise. You're maybe in Halo, or you're somewhere else. So I think that Star Wars itself has defined where you can go. And there were instances I remember when we were working on the New Jedi Order, where the Vong were the Yuuzhan Vong were really barbaric species. And some of the writers who contributed to that series, there were moments when we were going through the books and trying to keep everything together, where writers went too far, and they had to be reined in. I think that actually we did end up going a little bit too far for Star Wars, but we were facing that problem.
Is there anything you would have made any different in the entire series?
In the entire series?
Yes.
Oh, it's really hard to look back and with a hindsight say that there was something that you'd do differently, because I feel that the whole thing worked pretty well. And to go back and say that I would change one thing or another, it would be, it's almost like going back in time and saying that you're going to change this, and you don't know quite what that change would create.
Mhm.
So, I really can't, for the whole, especially if we're talking about the whole series, I don't think that I can go back and say too much about what I would change, because I think it all turned out pretty darn well. And I'm afraid if we changed, any kind of minor thing, that it might have been created, caused a situation where an author would have gone off in a direction other than they did.
Mm-hmm.
And you just don't know. It was, I guess, I would be very reluctant to do that, because from the editor's standpoint, I'm sure, if I'm talking about Sue and Shelley, that it must have been like herding cats. and I think that they did a pretty good job of getting the cats where they wanted the cats to be.
I see.
If we change anything, I'm not sure that all the cats would have ended up at home.
People today speak of NJO in these exalted tones. A lot of people see it as the peak of the expanded universe. With your other novel, Darth Plagueis, how do you feel about that?
I don't even know anything about it. I mean, since I'm not on social media very much, I don't, I have no idea how people think. I'm very happy that they feel that way. Once my feeling is, with a book or any work of art, like, it's out there and then it has a life of its own. I don't feel brought, I don't feel elevated necessarily as a person by it. It's out there on its own, and that's what it is.
Right.
So,
it kind of becomes a public thing.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool that it's popular this many years out. It's always nice to see that. And I think it really speaks to some of the people they got to write for it. And having a plan, it wasn't a perfect plan. They didn't have everything worked out, but they did have a plan, and it was that collaboration between Lucasfilms and the publisher and the writers. And I say plural, right? Because oftentimes 3 or 4 of us would get on a conference call, right? Because that's what we had then, and hash things out. Like, this is what's happening in my book. How would that affect your book? And we were communicating in a way that I think was kind of rare, especially in licensed work up until that point. I meet people all the time. I went to a Star Wars convention in Charleston a few months back, back in May, and was really blown away. And I got a lot of follows on Instagram that are like big New Jedi Order fans. So it's interesting, kind of cool.
Good. How do you feel about the title Legends and kind of what happened with all of the novels?
For me, I can almost dismiss that Legends banner. I just have my own sense of the saga, the way it's played out, sort of almost like an alternative history. So all those stories are still in my head, and I think it's going to take more than a banner on a book to make me change my mind about what Tim Zahn did or what Mike Stackpole did or, what any of us have done.
When I wrote a Star Wars book, turned out without my knowledge that 17 other books used the world I created for my Star Wars.
Yeah, that ended up being how they beat the Yuuzhan Vong, I think.
Yeah.
So, now that's all not canon anymore.
Yes, it's all gone. So I created all these extra novels, and it's not canon anymore. But they could do well by bringing some of that plot line back.
Yeah, actually, now that you mention it, I did get a chance to talk to 1 or 2 other writers who had the same experience you did, where they created a book and then had it erased. How did you feel about that? Did you mind?
There's nothing I control about it. I mean, yeah. I wrote a good book, and it's been read by people, and they still go back. A lot of people still go back to read the non-canonical books and enjoy them just as much, if not more.
The hullabaloo about it was almost like they weren't going out and taking the book away from you and burning it. It's still a good book. It still exists.
This is what I worry about in terms of the sort of Legends controversy. There's so much good storytelling, in the Bantam era and in the Del Rey era, that it would be a shame if readers chose to ignore those because they're not part of the new canon, because they're just some great things.
This is a side thing. Did you know that George and Dave Filoni, who was doing the Clone Wars show, did you know that they planned to bring in the Yuuzhan Vong? Because they did.
Yeah.
They had so some years ago, Dave Filoni was doing a panel about, Clone Wars was canceled when the company was sold. Mm-hmm. And they had a panel of the stories that they had outlined with George and stuff ready to go. And one of them was about a 3-episode arc with the Yuuzhan Vong.
That would have been a kick.
I know.
So what are we looking at today? The Untold Clone Wars. What does the Untold Clone Wars mean?
All these scripts that we have, all these drawings that we had done, all these story reels that were shot. Let's get together and talk about it.
Could you believe that this would ever show up anywhere?
Wow.
This is me going through Dave's sketchbook going, Dave,
what are you doing?
What is this?
Getting all Vector Prime up in here.
Well, yes.
Wow.
Once you make the Mandalorians pacifists and bring Darth Maul back from the dead, anything is really possible in your mind. So we were working on a story that involved the Vong in a very minimal way. It was kind of a scout ship that was trying to assess the strength of the Republic and kind of what Jedi were, and it got a little bit into that. It was pretty creepy, and this was just an exploration I did of what a ship would look like, and all those kind of flanges on the side were going to kind of move and oscillate as it moved through space, and that's a Jedi cruiser in front of it, just to give you a sense of scale.
Yeah. It was really playing, the storyline really played on the alien abduction vibe. It was almost like an X-Files episode of Star Wars: The Clone Wars.
It was going to be pretty creepy, and then I started to explore some of the armor of what I had seen of the Vong and how I was going to take and distill it down to an animated style, but we never got that far.
Always in motion is the future.
Oh, yeah.
That would have been fun.
It would have been like an X-Files thing. They come and abduct.
Yeah.
What would be your thought about that?
Well, I'd have to see it first. You always want to see these things.
Is there anything that like precludes Disney from being like, who's great as a villain? Let's get them back in here.
No, there's nothing to stop them. Part of the massive contract that we all sign is that everything that we produce belongs to the Star Wars universe. It's not our private stuff.
There's a ton of things that aren't revealed in the movies, but that obviously exist in the lore of Star Wars, in the story of Star Wars. And the EU has been our attempt to take you into areas that aren't explored in the movies and give you much more depth.
You think there's still like a fan base for NJO? I have no idea. Are people still reading it, or has what Disney has done, has that just pushed all that other stuff to the side or off the edge of the earth?
Well, Jim, there's a Star Wars community on Reddit which it's only devoted to the old expanded universe. It's not devoted to the new, and they have 300,000 members in there. In fact, it has been very odd for me. When the company was sold in 2012, I would have never in a million years, and this is me as a fan, I would have never in a million years expected the resurgence in interest that has happened since that time. I think part of it is people being a little dissatisfied with the sequels, and then part of it is just people probably had older brothers or parents who had these books, and the amount of interest in NJO these days is crazy.
That's amazing. Are you keeping up with all the current publications too?
I'll be honest with you. NJO got me so interested in other things when I read it, like literature and world stuff that I started.
That's good. That's great.
Yeah, I started to leave Star Wars and just started to actually. Lately, I've been reading this book, but you probably read it, by Bernal Diaz, who was with Cortez.
Oh, that's a great book. Yeah, that's a great book. Yeah.
When I read Traitor, I had never even thought about the things he was discussing. That got me so interested in things like Zen Buddhism.
Oh, fantastic.
It was specifically NJO that had all these things that you can talk about.
Well, I get, when you have so many authors contributing to a series, you're going to get lots of influences, right? I mean, influences coming from all directions.
Right. No, that's what I love about it. I love that it had so many voices.
I can just say I'm very fond of Star Wars fans because I ran the kind of the Star Wars publishing program at Lucasfilm Licensing for, I think, about 10 years. And I always found Star Wars readers and writers to be very intelligent, very interesting, well-educated people. So all I can say is it must be that thing that I liked about them so much when I was generating Star Wars books that is, they're broadly interested in more than just Star Wars because they are well-educated, intelligent people.
We like to think so.
Working with Star Wars fans was one of the absolute best part of my jobs. Exceptional group of people, I have to say.
Thank you. Star Wars was designed to stimulate the imagination of young people, and that's why I did it. That was the intention, which was to get kids to think and use their imaginations and go home, draw pictures of the characters, make their own stories, but to express themselves and to think and use their imagination.